Hello and welcome to Hack the Capital, where I will talk about exorcising the ghost in the machine, a critical evaluation of, not necessarily just ICS focused supply chain attacks, but certainly critical infrastructure and related sort of activity, since that is a very popular topic these days. So first, who am I? So currently, I'm actually a employee at Gigamon, but just prior to delivering this presentation, I was still at Domain Tools, who is responsible for sponsoring this research, where I was conducting open-ended threat research. Prior to that, I was an adversary hunter at Dragos and have significant government experience in both the U.S. Navy as well as the Department of Energy at Los Alamos National Laboratory. Domain Tools, who made this research possible, is a company specializing in threat intelligence data and enrichment, and I really thank them for letting me go through with this despite a recent job change. But enough about me. Our agenda today is we're going to talk about what supply chain attack vectors are, what they may be, and then look into the execution and control of intrusions and use that as a way to then explore the inherent difficulties for adversaries in successfully conducting this sort of an attack, and then what sort of advantages accrue to defenders based upon the limitations inherent to a supply chain vector compromise or intrusion situation. So first, the supply chain. Seems quite simple. We have the series of interlinked or interdependent stages from raw materials through intermediate providers of goods and services onto their final destination, including consumers or, in a more business-to-business environment, other organizations. The thing is, though, is that supply chains are maddeningly complex, and it's really more apt to look at this as a very complex interconnected supply web of goods and service providers extending through both physical and logical or software components that all need to come together in just the right way in order to enable operations. And so from an operator standpoint, supply chains can be somewhat brittle just given their very complexity, while also potentially exposing a lot of possible ingress points for an adversary. So looking at that, we have a number of potential ingress points or touch points for adversaries in trying to impact or get into the supply chain for a given organization. We have product and services components, with those further breaking down into hardware and device supply chain security on the product side, as well as software and even underlying code bases if we're talking about open source projects. And then for services, we have external partners and other entities, as well as internal service entities, entities we invite into our networks to manage things for us, such as managed service providers and similar organizations. So from a product-based supply chain perspective, I think this is the most straightforward and what we commonly think about when we talk about a supply chain intrusion, that we compromise a vendor or supplier, and then using that compromise, we leverage the access to design and deliver a capability injected into or inserted into that product that then allows us to do some unspecified bad thing, whether that's facilitating access through the insertion of a backdoor or the creation of something like a logic bomb or something else along those lines, which could have a potentially disruptive characteristic later on. And we see examples of this, oddly enough, some of the more successful and notable ones coming from US and related operators, such as the alleged NSA upgrade factory for Cisco routers, inserting backdoors prior to delivery to follow on end users, and the crypto AG supply chain intrusion, which lasted for quite some time and facilitated quite a bit of intelligence operations. But we also have some possible myths. So, for example, there's the apocryphal story of the CIA inserting some code into a bit of operating components that they knew would be stolen by Russian intelligence operatives during the Cold War, and then through this insertion enabled or caused later on a overpressurization event that then led to an explosion. Well, that sounds really cool, but as Tom Ridd has pointed out, we're not quite sure that that really happened. So we'll stick a pin in this one and say that, yeah, the scenarios we can build in our minds for supply chain scenarios are pretty scary, but in actuality, we're not seeing that many examples, at least from the hardware perspective. On the software side, though, we do see quite a bit of activity, and especially in the last 10 years. Some very notable events would be the ASUS backdoors installed through motherboard firmware, which was very extensive, but then resulted in a very targeted campaign. I think this gets overlooked a lot because it was a very well-executed attack, but seemed to be targeting gaming companies, which means it flew under the radar of a lot of people, especially in the national security community. Or the CC Cleaner incident that Talos reported on a few years ago, which was also incredibly widespread, but again, whether a combination of your supply chains weren't sexy then, or because it didn't really appear to manifest in anything really critical in terms of follow-on impacts. Again, we've kind of forgotten about this because, well, anyway, we'll get to that in a second. But we do see these sorts of software supply chain vectors showing up in critical infrastructure events. Most notably within the last 10 years, the Dragonfly or Crouching Yeti or Berserk Bear, however you want to phrase this campaigns, which involved inserting or rather repackaging certain industrial control-centric software in order to introduce additional capabilities to them and allow for the installation of a family of malware referred to as Havocs. And this was very widespread across the European Union, the United States, across utilities, manufacturers, oil and gas entities, very worrying stuff, but not, at least as far as we know, resulting in any deliberate disruptive operations, but certainly showing that adversaries have recognized the latent power or capability of leveraging a software-based supply chain intrusion in order to get into various critical infrastructure sectors. And we could say that the most successful event is the one that's the sort of 800-pound gorilla in the room right now, which will be addressed at multiple talks, I have a feeling, at this event. The SolarWinds Sunburst compromise, although I would caution everyone to recognize that this campaign was far more than just SolarWinds. There was a significant Microsoft component to this as well. But in looking at this, we see via the compromise of a development environment at the vendor, SolarWinds, the follow-on capability of infecting over 18,000, give or take, environments, and then utilizing some specific logic within the implant to then narrow that initial take or that initial compromise down to only a small subset of follow-on victims. So really cool stuff. But we've already kind of seen things like this before, like the ASUS item or the CC Cleaner item that actually resulted in even wider spread effects. So as much as the SolarWinds event seems like it's the most successful and scary event ever, we've had examples of this taking place before, although maybe not associated with the same sort of actors. So I would caution people from saying that Sunburst is some sort of game-changing incident. We also have unproven examples. So for example, there is the story that has been roundly criticized, yet never retracted, from Bloomberg about the insertion of rice-size components onto motherboards from Supermicro. Very scary stuff, never really proven in practice, no indications of this having any sort of effect anywhere in the world. Or from a hardware perspective, there's also been talk over the last year in the electric utility sector of the modification of electric transformers, which could potentially be very scary, although if you look at analysis from industry experts like Chris Sistrunk, as well as discussions from Dale Peterson and others, that it is debatable, one, whether or not this even happened, and two, what sort of control or capability might be introduced as well. So again, sounds scary, but unproven and indeterminate how you would actually weaponize this sort of event. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But before we get into impacts, let's talk about services, because I think this often gets overlooked, even though it comes up once in a while in the popular consciousness. So here we're talking about the sort of external parties or entities that we interact with or rely upon in order to operate our organizations. And probably the most notable, although again, overlooked and we've kind of forgotten about this example of this sort of activity, is the Target data breach from nearly a decade ago now, where a criminal entity leveraged the trust relationship between an HVAC contractor and Target retail in order to compromise the HVAC contractor, move into the Target network in order to the Target retailer network, and then pivot into the point of sale terminals to harvest credit card numbers. So, no national security implications here maybe, but certainly showing how that interlinkages between something as seemingly minor or overlooked from a cyber perspective, like a contractor that has access to smart building systems, can then result in a follow-on breach of significance. But we've seen this in more alarming contexts as well, such as the Cloud Hopper campaigns and similar APT-41 activity linked by US authorities to the Chinese government, where we've seen through the compromise of various managed service providers the ability to then rapidly migrate into a number of other networks and facilitating intrusions. So really scary stuff, because through this sort of intrusion, you can leapfrog across over multiple security layers by taking advantage of that implicit and necessary trust relationship with the service provider. And we've seen these sorts of relationships and abuse of these relationships take place in the electric sector, specifically the United States, possibly Europe as well. Jury's out on that one. The US government has reported on this as part of the Palmetto Fusion series of activity in 2017 and 2018. And then the Wall Street Journal with Rebecca Smith and Rob Berry had an excellent write-up on this as well. But what was interesting about this, and very similar to the Target example, is the attackers identified specific, very focused contractors, and often very small entities, like a 20-person excavation contractor in Oregon, and then utilize the implicit trust between contractor and utility to launch follow-on phishing and credential harvesting campaigns to get into utility networks. Now, no indications that any of these sorts of campaigns resulted in or were intended to cause some sort of disruptive effect, but we can identify access. And that becomes very scary and shows how these trust relationships can easily be abused for malicious purposes. But that's all well and good. We've talked about a lot of ways of using the supply chain, or just really trust relationships between vendors and consumers, in order to get into networks. Then we're not really sure what happens, because ultimately what our goal is to achieve some sort of cyber objective, but just simply compromising the supply chain does not get us to this point where we can start executing whatever it is we're desiring within the victim environment. Because as we start blowing this up a little bit, we see that supply chain intrusions are rather complex and are not terribly simple to execute, because really what we've done is multiply the number of intrusions and events that we need to succeed in from the attacker's perspective in order to execute our desired impact. And that starts with doubling the amount of reconnaissance and intrusions we have to conduct, not just identifying who my ultimate victims are, but also who are their suppliers, or what are the areas of the supply chain I need to get into in order to deliver to my ultimate victim, and then figuring out how to take advantage of those relationships in order to create some capability that I can then start moving into an environment. But I have to make sure that I have some ability to either migrate that capability in an autonomous fashion, which means I give up some control, or I have an ability to continuously communicate and manage whatever I introduce into the environment so that I can have positive control over its operation. And that all means that I'm injecting lots of complexity into these intrusions that make them rather difficult and non-trivial to execute in practice. And so what we see here are a number of choices that an intruder faces. And we can map these out fairly well across two axes, one concerning control or autonomy, and another concerning targeting or victimology. So along these lines, we can have capabilities that are completely autonomous, but involve us giving up positive control, or items that are very manually operated, which means we need to talk to them, communicate with them reliably in order to make them useful. From a victimology or targeting perspective, we could be very specific, like what we saw with the SolarWinds case of really introducing checks or other items to make sure that we're very narrowly targeting items. Or we can go for an outright general distribution pathway where we don't care who we infect. We're just going to introduce something into the supply chain and watch the world burn from there, which obviously entails some degree of risks. And we see this mapped out to actual events. So Sunburst being fairly autonomous and specific in victimology, at least from an initial intrusion perspective. The Palmetto Fusion campaigns being very specific in victim selection, but very manually operated in terms of credential harvesting and phishing. Something like Dragonfly, though, gets a little bit different in that there was no control over who received the malicious software updates, but once they were deployed, control over them was fairly manual, meaning that there was a check involved in the process to make sure this didn't turn into a exploit all the things. But then on the other side, we have something like NotPetya, which did start off as a supply chain intrusion vector through the MEDOC infection in Ukraine, which kicked everything off. And then once that infection started, the attackers basically threw caution to the winds and just let it propagate completely autonomously with no control whatsoever in a generally distributed fashion. And the thing is that looking at all of these items, we start seeing constraints on adversary operations in terms of operational control, the willingness to accept or cause collateral damage outside of the intended effect, and operational security for what is deployed and for the attacker's operations overall, just not getting caught. So looking at this, we see a number of challenges adhering to supply chain intrusions and supply chain operations. From an access perspective, I need to try to deliver a capability to targets, but I want to make sure that I'm not spreading too far, because that causes a number of potential problems, and that's a surefire way to start drawing defender or policymaker attention. From a communication perspective, unless I can design something that it can be completely autonomous and that I can trust will operate correctly in the environment I deliver it into, I need to figure out some way of maintaining control while also avoiding detection. And finally, from an impact perspective, I need to achieve my objective, whether that's allowing for access or introducing some destructive or disruptive capability, but I want to make sure that I'm ensuring focus to, again, avoid that collateral damage scenario where I just don't introduce something into the overall supply chain and then see effects pop up in places that I did not desire them to appear in. So from an intruder, they have a number of questions that they need to ask. How to gain access to their desired target while avoiding other entities, how to maintain control over a capability while maintaining stealth, and to either create a way to retrieve their effects package out of the environment or to keep it hidden in some way without getting caught. And ultimately, we want to try to avoid any sort of defender attention when expanding out from that initial supply chain access bridgehead. All of these introducing not just attacker dependencies, but touch points that we can utilize from a defender's perspective in order to detect and defeat these sort of intrusions in progress. And we see these risks presented in the WannaCry in this case, but very similar to NotPetya. I just didn't have a good graphic for NotPetya, of spreading too far, in which case we don't have control over our capability and we could cause unintended effects and consequences based upon this. We have the problem of control, that even if the defenders don't spot us, that through some change in the environment or other areas that we have no real guidance over or control over, that all of a sudden we've lost communication with our implant or the vector goes away. It's out of our hands, and it's something that we have to rely on others to continue to act in a way that we can understand or can predict in order to maintain these sorts of capabilities. And finally, there's just effectiveness. We can go through all of the stages of delivering a very narrowly targeted, completely autonomous sort of capability, and then when it arrives in its final destination or where effects actually get delivered on target, it doesn't work. And we've actually seen this with most of our critical infrastructure targeting cyber events, not supply chain related, but between the 2016 Ukraine event, the 2017 Saudi Arabia event, and other incidents where in industrial environments especially, attackers just things didn't work out as intended. And there are some resources that are linked at the end of this presentation that go into those in detail. But those were manually operated intrusion scenarios. We start adding additional difficulty when we basically leave control away or make control much more difficult through a supply chain scenario, and thus increase the risk that once we get into an intended environment, that it's not quite what we were expecting or anticipating, and then our final payload is somehow inert. Now, you may be saying, oh, wait a minute, Joe, the attacker only has to be successful once, but the defender has to be right every time. So really, defenders are somewhat disadvantaged through this process. And I would argue that that is a complete misunderstanding of how this works in practice. Because if we actually look at not just the attacker dependencies and difficulties that we've already talked about, but the inherent advantages to network defense and monitoring, especially when we start talking about complex networks such as industrial control environments or well-segmented environments, that really we need to flip the script and say the attacker needs to be right multiple times, whereas as a defender, we just need to catch the attacker at some point, ideally before that execution of objectives on target stage, but still, identifying just at one point of those interlinked set of dependent operations means that we can stop an intrusion in its tracks. And we see this through latent defender advantages, such as just the pure home field advantage of owning the network. We own and manage the network. We understand what is normal about that network, and we maintain the ability to gain visibility into communications. Now, certainly there's a little bit of an asterisk there because of the popularity of encryption software. I would argue that there is much to be said about the desirability of letting all things be encrypted versus breaking encryption, at least internally, for monitoring purposes. But even when we have communications that are SSL wrapped, we still have visibility into the directionality and other metadata items surrounding communication pathways. And all of these combined give us visibility into an environment where attackers are often flying blind. So we can use this for an already difficult to execute operation, a supply chain intrusion, to really press an advantage home and make an adversary's life difficult. And by looking at this, an IT network already retains certain defensive advantages just because it's our network. We theoretically know and understand it, we own and control it. If we start adding on additional capabilities, which are not all that exotic and are quite realistic, such as well-segmented and designed networks, we can start enhancing and multiplying these advantages, and thus looking at a proper segmentation and network control and network boundary management can show these benefits in practice and how we can really make an attacker's life significantly difficult. So for example, looking at the Purdue reference architecture, which is primarily used for looking at the relationship between network segments in industrial environments, we see multiple enclaves or multiple layers of a network or operational environment where we can apply defense and response through the entire sequence of events to really make life rough for an adversary. That starts at the network boundary, where we have visibility and control into external network ingress and egress. That's where most organizations do a pretty good job, but we need to start expanding that so we're not operating with this M&M-like defensive construct with a nice hard outer shell and then a gooey soft center. Because as we start diving into networks, network segmentation, enclave separation, and then including monitoring and visibility between enclaves allows us to start spotting the movement of attackers into our network, or if the attacker has bypassed the ingress item because they've inserted some sort of supply chain control component, spotting when the attacker tries to phone home or tries to move laterally throughout the environment, or just try to press their advantage or press or move out from their initial beachhead within the network. And then as we start talking about critical infrastructure networks, we have additional components that we can add, such as further segmentation, but also the ability to monitor and understand the fundamental processes and applications that are operating in our environment in terms of baselining, anomaly detection, and even just simple things like network traffic directionality, common control system environment, communication flows, and similar that can try to identify when an attacker has breached our environment and trying to execute something malicious. And finally, even if an attacker has managed to penetrate in a critical infrastructure or industrial environment, all of these layers of defense and control, we still have engineering controls in place in order to prevent or mitigate against worst case scenarios that often get overlooked when talking about cyber intrusions into these sorts of networks. Engineers are not stupid. In fact, they're a lot smarter than I am, and many of you are as well, probably. And they have designed these networks, these processes, to be resilient in such a fashion that, yes, something bad may happen, but it's not going to be plant explosion or something similar. It'll be product venting. It will be emergency shutdown, which is still painful and disruptive, but is far easier to recover from than, again, the worst case scenarios. And so we have all of this resiliency as well as visibility built in, and we just need to take advantage of it. Now, certainly there are prerequisites towards execution. So, for example, for identifying and understanding traffic flows within the network and what might be weird, anomalous, or just outright malicious, we need to understand what the assets are in our network. And so having some way of identifying, tagging, and understanding what assets are talking to which can be quite necessary and also quite difficult to execute in practice. That also gets us into traffic visibility, understanding those traffic flows and being able to control and shape them in such a way so that we can gain insight into them and be able to monitor them. Finally, network segmentation is key, and unfortunately we have way too many flat networks that are out there, and as a result of that we are ceding a potentially built-in advantage we have from the operator defender perspective to adversaries, and we need to overcome that, whether that be through virtual network segmentation or more difficult, but when we have the chance through plant refreshes, upgrades, and similar, actual physical network segmentation. And lastly, we need to arm, equip, and enable our personnel to give them both the tools and the capability necessary to take advantage of all of these built-in components to defending the network, but also give them the power or the confidence to press this advantage against adversaries so that we're not constantly operating in a fearful reactive mode, but rather in a more forceful forward-leaning mode vis-a-vis cyber intrusions. So to conclude, attackers are increasingly seeking to subvert trust relationships in the form of supply chain compromises. That's a indisputable fact. It's been going on for a decade, though, so this is nothing new. It's just getting more attention and potentially getting caught more often. But despite the concern around these items, defenders still retain a natural advantage in detecting and defeating these intrusions. By understanding how those advantages operate, as well as the limitations that an adversary faces in trying to execute a supply chain intrusion, we can start investing in secure architecture, network and host visibility, and worthwhile active monitoring in order to really press these advantages and make an attacker's life significantly difficult and ensuring greater resiliency in a variety of networks, from defense industrial base to government and public sector networks to critical infrastructure and industrial environments. So these slides will be made available somewhere. There's a number of resources here. This is just a brief sample. This is also going to end up as a paper in the not so distant future, so please look out for that as well. I don't know where it'll be hosted, but pay attention and we'll find out. But I thank everyone for being able to attend. So certainly there is a question slide. There were some technical difficulties in the original discussion, and so we weren't able to actually do a Q&A. So this is a re-recording, but certainly feel free to reach out to either myself directly or my colleagues at Domain Tools or others within the field of network security or industrial specific security if you'd like to learn more about this. So thank you, everyone. I hope this was informative, and yeah, let's go bust some adversaries' heads together and not live in fear of them, because they've got life just as, if not harder than we do. Thanks, everyone.